I've never seen a family that didn't have something going on. So if somebody has a traumatic experience, there will be a full brain body response that can actually be inherited.
Do you sometimes have reactions you don't even understand? All of us grew in different family dynamics, and those ever-changing interactions between your family members influence your behavior and shape the way you experience your life. Steve, how do you reckon a family dynamic can influence us?
Well, I think whatever kind of family system we're in, there's going to be dynamics between the people, and we're going to learn or develop based on how those people relate to each other. So if people are aware of emotions and they are caring of each other and they're not trying to sort of compete with each other or beat each other at getting more of something, more love or more attention, more resources, more food, whatever, then if they're thoughtful, caring, and more emotionally aware, then those skills will be developed more in that person. The child growing up might pick up on some patterns of behavior, both things they'd be aware of and things they wouldn't be aware of, that would influence how they manage themselves and manage their emotional experience. So they might learn, let's say, a bad habit if the child learns to play the victim, for example, and then get sympathy from, let's say, the mother. But that feeling and that idea might stick with that child. And then as they get older through life, that becomes a strategy or way to deal with others. So if there's somebody in authority, that person then might choose to play victim as a way to cope or try to ally with other people in the system. Let's say it's at work or a group of friends, and try to then play out the same victim behavior. And they themselves are feeling like a victim, like they're being judged or bullied. So that's an example of how a family dynamic can play out in a particular way in which a person would not have a very advanced or developed way to deal with their emotional state. They'd sort of fall into this pattern of feeling like a victim over and over again.
Okay, so since you mentioned childhood and how each dynamic influences our first years of being a member in the family, what was your own experience? And do you think your family dynamics influence your behavior since the moment you were born?
Since even before I was born, there were impacts on my life and on my development. But anyway, those family members were going through a lot of their own problems. They were not functioning well. And so, yeah, it was not a functional environment to grow up in. And so, as a result, I had a lot of issues with being able to regulate my emotions, issues with being able to recognize flawed thinking. I somehow acquired the awareness that I was able to eventually learn and develop, even though it was at a slower pace than other people. And that can also have to do with just some people develop slower anyway, so it's not entirely necessarily due to the environment. And yet, as a result of being challenged, having those deficits, I was able to then recognize that I needed to focus on those things. And that's kind of what brought me to psychology, because I think my story is not unique. I think a lot of people that are attracted to psychology are attracted to wanting to learn more about these issues, probably because they themselves have had something going on in their lives that had to do with that. I know friends that are doctors that because a family member had an issue or a disease, they went into that field, whether it was, endocrinology or urology or cardiology or whatever. They had a family member that suffered or they themselves suffered, and so they wanted to be masters of that issue. And the same for me.
Okay, so you said it started even before you were born. So do you think that means that there's a genetic factor to take into account? And do you think that what happened to previous generations can affect us genetically?
I would say that the idea of transgenerational trauma has to do with the fact that if a great grandmother or mother went through something that was either physically or emotionally challenging that caused a significant shift in that person's physiology. And remember that, when our brain is reacting, it's processing information, but it's not doing that, in a jar somewhere. It's embodied. So the whole body and the mind and everything is all one thing. So that experience, if it's, you know, significant to the person, that's a whole body change. And we know from research over the last several decades that certain parts of your DNA can turn on and off that then change the way that your body, the cells themselves behave, and then the organ systems behave. So when that happens, that's a shift that can actually be inherited. In other words, that can be passed down. So if somebody has a traumatic experience and then they have a reaction to that, let's say like there's not enough food, or let's say they are constantly under threat of physical violence or something like that, there will be a full brain body response that then gets kind of recorded into the body mind system. And that can be identified in terms of the response. There are stress hormones that are released and things like that. This can be passed on so that there's a propensity maybe to go into a certain emotional state, or there's a propensity to be having a different metabolism. So these things are transgenerational. And if they are quote unquote traumatic, meaning they're involving a person's emotional life, then that can be passed on in some way. How that manifests, particularly in each individual, I think it's really hard to predict, but it certainly is part of the picture that we need to understand. So if your great grandmother went through a horrible war or something like that, there's likely something about the way that your mind body system works that might have been affected by that.
Okay, so what you're saying is family narratives and previous generations can really define the way we construct our reality and the way we experience our environment, right? Why don't we dive into this concept a little bit more using the neurocog system that you've developed? So you propose that our construct of reality is not actually what's real, and instead it's us who shape it. Can you please explain this a little bit more?
Sure. So we know from developmental studies, there are certain things that happen in development. Like if you learn a language, for the most part, there are some exceptions. Past the age of 12, you'll have an accent. There's a window of development. And once it's passed, right? In that process of development, we also develop an understanding of the environment in which we live. But our construct isn't just our visual and auditory perception of reality. It's also our construct that's bigger than that, like our construct of who we are and who other people are and what it's like to be alive and stuff like that. That's all stuff we create in our mind. And because that's not entirely accurate, we know that it's possible in terms of things that we can adjust, not our physical perception of reality, but ideas about ourselves, ideas about how the world works, ideas about how other people are, ideas about what life is like. Those can be adjusted, changed, or shifted into a space that's a little more, I think, in line with the way the world actually works. Because people, when they find they're frustrated, it's often, and this is the case with myself, I had a construct of reality that didn't really fit the way the world was as much. I mean, nobody's construct is perfect, but mine was definitely farther away. And that's because the way I grew up, the way I developed, I missed some windows. I didn't have some understandings, and I had to acquire those later on in life as an adult. And now I have a better construct. It's still flawed, but I know enough to be able to help other people discover the same method I did to improve their construct. And that's the point of the neurocog system, is to help people develop that awareness. So maybe you didn't get it early in life. Well, maybe you didn't learn how to play an instrument earlier in life, or you didn't learn a language earlier in life. Well, you can acquire it later. It'll be different than if you had acquired it as a child, because children can pick up things so quickly. It's also different in the sense that you have to sort of unlearn maybe some things that weren't very good lessons to learn. But if your intention is to grow and develop, well, that's what it's all about.
Right. So, more about choosing to work on ourselves and keep growing. I personally believe that if we have a negative perception about our own family dynamics, it can affect our relationships with our family members. Are the ways we construct these perceptions always accurate?
So a lot of people have negative experiences and then maybe negative ways to see their family. On the other hand, some people have idealistic ways to see their family. They might have some very rigid ideas that make them very resistant to seeing a more accurate picture of who their family members are. So if you have an idealistic view of your mother or your father and they can do no wrong or something, and in fact, not seeing them as just normal human beings that have flaws, or if you have an overly negative view of a family member, a mother or a father, or sister, or brother, and you think, oh, they're just the worst person ever, and you go on and on and on how about terrible they are, then it really paints a very distorted picture. It's just sort of like any situation. You can see it as horribly bad, or you can kind of see kind of it's a mixed bag. And like every family, and I've worked with hundreds, I've never seen a family that didn't have something going on that was a problem or an issue for them that they could probably improve on. And perception is at the core of that. How people see their families, how people see the people in their families. That's what it's all about. Because I say always, like, this perception is what drives that emotional state. That emotional state is what would drive your action or inaction.
Right. Okay. So, what you're saying is that it can end up defining if you want to keep working on that relationship or not. So, let's say you do recognize there's a family narrative that needs to be unraveled. What kind of suggestion would you give to that person?
Well, first is to be aware that there is a family narrative. So when we talk about a family narrative, we also really talk about a family story, right? The narrative is a story. And if your family story is, uh, we struggled and then we overcame, for example, that's the story. Or we've always been very successful and we continue to be successful, and that's your story, or your family narrative, so to speak. Or, you know, two families, a rich one and a poor one, got together and somehow worked out an understanding, but it always was problematic because of resentments. I mean, the stories go on and on, right? If you're aware that stories are created and don't really reflect an accurate reality, then you can transcend them. And it's also a good opportunity to check the facts and see, well, what's really true about, great Uncle Sade, who was a general in the war or whatever. And that's why our family is always having issues or something because of his drinking, or I don't know what. There are these narratives that play through. And there's there's something called narrative therapy, right? And it ties to that. So how I incorporate, once again, another modality into something that's just normal, everyday human experience is we talk about how stories impact people's lives. And your family story is often one of the most powerful stories to impact your life. You don't have to think it's 100% true, though. And once you suspend judgment and you become ambivalent about the family story and curious about the family story, then in that sense, by stepping away and pretending that it's not your family story, but you're discovering it for the first time, then you can see it in a different light and it becomes an entirely different experience for you. And then you can shift it over to something that might be less difficult, less obstructive, less of a sort of a barrier to things in your life. And it opens up a whole bunch of possibilities where you might think, well, I could never do this, I could never do that because we are this kind of a family and that's our story and da 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 da. That just might not be really true. And so you've restricted yourself and kept yourself back because of a story. Just a story. So if you see family narratives as just stories, is the point, then you don't have to be controlled or ruled by them. You're free.
That was Dr. Steve Wolfson on The Good Shift. Thanks for listening to today's episode. We hope you found it insightful. Don't forget, you can listen to more episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. For extra tips and updates, follow us on Instagram and TikTok to learn more about the Nuri app. Download the app today to access exercises that enhance your emotional awareness and help you make better decisions aligned with your life goals. See you next time.